We're talking about your new book, a memoir called We Can Be Heroes, which you call a survivor's story. Let's talk about that.
Well, I'm a survivor in many different respects. So I've nearly died twice. Once when I was 18, once when I was 38. The AIDS pandemic, I lived through that and was involved in ACT UP and was an AIDS activist. And I'm a survivor of childhood abuse. And I had some therapy a couple of years back, and I toyed with the idea of writing a memoir, but I didn't know quite how to go about it, where to begin, where to end. And when COVID came, I was supposed to be working on my 7th novel, and I found it impossible to write fiction during lockdown. And so my agent said, why don't you do some work on that memoir? And once he'd suggested it, it sort of seemed so obvious because we were living through a time that in many ways felt very familiar to me.
Yeah.
Because I'd lived through a pandemic before. And once I kind of got that into my head, then the story came quite easily. And I spoke to Russell T Davies because he's a friend of mine, and he'd interviewed me or take me for brunch and sort of you know, fed me and sort of picked my brains, as it were, for stories. Because when he was writing what became It's a Sin, it was first originally called The Boys. He wanted stories about London because he was not in London at the time. And I told him about various things that happened to friends of mine, some of which ended up in the drama. And when that drama was then shown during COVID, and I know that Russell and the team were quite worried whether people would want to watch a drama about an epidemic during an epidemic. And actually it worked in their favor, because I think it made a lot of people, they could relate more so than before. So I kind of took that as being a kind of good sign that the time was right, that people were connecting with It's a Sin, people who weren't around at that time, or maybe even were around but just weren't aware of what was going on, because it was such an isolated, it was only certain groups that were so heavily affected by it. So all of that sort of seemed like the right thing to do. Also, I'm obsessed with David Bowie, and he had saved me on so many occasions. There's a line in the book which is, I used it in a magazine article after he died. I was asked to write about him, and I opened the article by saying, when I was 14, David Bowie saved my life. And people thought I was exaggerating or joking, but I wasn't. It's the absolute truth. I was a very, very isolated, very unhappy, very depressed and suicidal teenager, and there was no representation in those days. This is in the early 80s. I didn't have anyone to turn to, or late 70s, early 80s, and suddenly I saw David Bowie on television one night. I think it was on the Kenny Everett show originally, doing Boys Keep Swinging, and it completely blew my mind. So that would have been 79, and it completely blew my mind, and I became obsessed with him, and I went and bought all the records I could find, all the backlists, and all the books I could find, and read all these amazing interviews that had happened years before I discovered him, where he talked so openly about being bisexual, and made it seem not only acceptable, but actually something to aspire to. And for me, that was mind-blowing. And when the AIDS crisis came along, I was 23 when it impacted on me personally, directly, with my friends suddenly getting ill. I had no choice but to come out fighting. I'd never been a fighter before. And it was a turning point in my life. And whenever I share pictures from those days on social media, because thankfully there's a big archive by a photographer called Gordon Rainsford, who photographed lots of ACT UP for London. And whenever I share those pictures, people say, "Oh, you were such heroes, you were such heroes." I never felt that I was a hero then, but looking back now, I'm surprised at how brave I was. I was 23 and very naive, and very quite a traumatized young person, and I found strength I didn't know I had. And I think the message of the book is that we're stronger than we think we are, and that we can survive more than we think we can. And if somebody reads the book and finds that helpful, then the book has done its job.
We know part of your story already, because you're one of the people that contributed to Gregory's fabulous Riot Act, which is based on 4 stories. Yours is one of them. Why did you do that?
Well, Alexis is a very good friend of mine, and I really trust him, and I really value his work. I'd seen his previous plays, one of which was a straightforward play,
Mm.
and one of which was a verbatim play where he'd interviewed various people and based the play on their words. So when he asked me if I would take part in this, I was actually in therapy at the time, and he asked me if I would be willing to be interviewed for it, and I said yes. I hadn't talked about that period. I'd sort of bottled it away. I'd
Mm.
sort of put it away, and I hadn't really dealt with it. And when I was in therapy, it obviously came up, that whole period where, you know, from the age of 23 to about 30, I was just going through this period of immense personal loss
Yeah.
and trauma and guilt,
Mm.
survivor's guilt, which no one talked about back then. And I thought this would be a good thing to do. So Alexis came over to interview me, and we sat down and we talked, and I got very emotional. And then I saw the piece. He was, because they're the separate stories, he was
Yeah.
trying them out at POLARI, the literary salon that I run. And they were like 20-minute segments. And the first time he performed my piece, I was in floods of tears. I had to go on afterwards and say, you know, Alexis Gregory, everyone. Oh, I was so emotional. Thankfully, we went to an interval at that point. But I saw the reaction, and I saw the reaction of younger people in particular, which I was really taken aback at. I think I naively and wrongly assumed that young LGBT people weren't that interested in what we went through, but actually I discovered that I was very wrong to assume
Yeah.
that. And that night I spoke to a lot of young people after the performance, and many of them said that they were interested and did want to know, but they didn't know how to raise the subjects. They didn't want to upset somebody who'd lived through it,
Yeah.
which I hadn't thought of, which I, to my shame, really. So I think seeing that connection and seeing how that play moved audiences. I do say in the book that I wouldn't have written the memoir had it not been for doing that play.
You touched on POLARI, but before we go on to which is the club you founded and curated and has an award, but before we talk about the club, you need to talk to me about the word and where it came from, because we have a global audience who
Yeah,
never
of
heard
course.
of Kenneth Williams.
Of
So
course.
please explain why it's called that and what you actually do.
Well, Polari is a name that was given to a slang that's often referred to as being a gay slang, although it wasn't exclusively a gay slang. It was also used by people in the circus, by people in the military, especially sailors, and carnival people. It was, and gypsies and travelers, and it was a way of, gay people adopted it as a way of communicating this is in England and the UK, at a time when speaking openly could get you arrested, and being arrested would mean going to prison. So pre gay liberation, pre the relaxation of laws in the UK, which was 1967,
Yeah.
people tended to speak in Polari. I was born in 1965. 1965 was also the year that a program called Round the Horn appeared on Radio 4. And on that program, there was the wonderful Kenneth Williams, star of the Carry On films and other things. And he was playing one of two camp hairdressers called Julian and Sandy, and they spoke in Polari. So a lot of the jokes in on the show were very much insider jokes that many people outside wouldn't have understood, perhaps. I think also the, you know, British popular culture has this very strong tradition of embracing these very, very flamboyant, effeminate, camp male characters, provided they don't say anything that's sexual.
You chose this for your book club because
Well, I basically I was you know, as you alluded to, I've got many different roles and I do many different things. And at one point in my career, I was working part-time as a DJ, and I was DJing at this venue called the Green Carnation in Soho, which is sadly no longer there. It was very, very dedicated to Oscar Wilde. There was Oscar Wilde quotes on the wall and so on. And I was asked if I would DJ regularly, and I decided that rather than do that, I would do a night where I would DJ and play music, but I would also have a spoken word element to the evening. So at one point in the evening, there would be a writer, a performer, a poet, an author, showcasing some of their work. And I had to come up with the name really, really quickly because I had to give it to them the next day. And it just jumped into my head that I should call it Polari, because to me, from my understanding of it, from my personal experience of it, it literally meant gay words.
What's the biggest success of it? Making people aware of gay literature, or the award itself, which is quite prestigious now?
I think the biggest success for me, from a personal point of view, was just proving the point that there was an audience for
Mhm.
for these books and
Yeah.
this work. Because one of the big stumbling blocks that we've had in this country, I think maybe less so in the States, because we're such a small country by comparison, is there's always been an assumption that the market for gay books is tiny and not worth tapping into. And I wanted to prove that wasn't the case, because it's not only gay people who read books about gay characters. We know that. And it's absurd to assume that if a book has a great story to tell, to assume that other people won't put themselves in the feet of that character is just naive. You know, I read The Color Purple when I was 22 or something, and identified with it strongly. And I'm not a Black woman. You
You're
don't
not?
need to be. One doesn't need to be
Yeah.
from the same
Yeah.
demographic as the protagonist of a story to appreciate a story. That's ludicrous. So when I started Polari, it was really to prove that point, because I was so tired of
Mhm.
having doors shut in my face. I'd never been invited to a book festival ever at that point. This is 2007. I launched it. I'd published about 7 books at that point. Never once been invited to a book festival, and I thought, this is just it's heterosexist, and I'm
Yeah.
going to change this by creating my own platform. Once it took off and became really successful, which was it was actually faster than I'd anticipated. I didn't think
Yeah.
it would grow so quickly so soon. But once it did, then I saw that there was an opportunity then to not just showcase the established writers that I knew, but also to give opportunities to new and emerging
Mhm.
writers, try and encourage new people. Because, you know, when I was young, a lot of older gay men supported and helped me. And sadly, they were the friends that I lost
Yeah.
during the AIDS crisis. And I think it's in partly in honor of them, and partly because it's the right thing to do, that now that I'm in that position, I should be helping the next generation.
Before you go into books, you also were an activist. And I was fascinated because you were an activist in ACT UP UK, which I, for my sins, didn't know much about. How effective was it, and what did you achieve, you think, in that?
Well, I mean, ACT UP London was launched in February 1989.
Oh yeah.
My friend Vaughan had just told me he was positive about 3 months before that, and that was the first person that I knew
Mhm.
personally. And I at that time the prognosis wasn't great, because the
Yeah.
medications weren't very good, and he did deteriorate very quickly. His health deteriorated very rapidly, and I knew that if I didn't find an outlet that was constructive, I would probably go on a completely self-destructive path. And I saw this um, mention in the capital gay newspaper, which was the Free London Gay
Yeah.
paper, saying that there was this meeting happening at the London Lesbian and Gay Centre to form a group called ACT UP, based on the American model of ACT UP in New York and San Francisco. And I went along to the first meeting and I threw myself into it. And on a personal level, it saved me from myself in many, many ways. In terms of the effectiveness of ACT UP as an organization, it raised awareness. I think a lot of people back then, I mean, nowadays you couldn't even get away with this because they've changed all the laws, but back then you could literally get right to the gates of Downing Street.
Yeah.
So, for example, when John Major, who was then Chancellor, came to deliver his budget, and they just cut funding for people with HIV and AIDS and benefits and so on, we chained ourselves to the gates of Downing Street and blocked his way. That was all over the national news, because it had to be, because it was a newsworthy event, because it was John Major delivering the budget. We also blocked Westminster Bridge on World AIDS Day. Our very first demonstration was not so successful, which was catapulting condoms over the wall of Pentonville Prison, because they wouldn't allow condoms or needle exchanges in prisons. And of course, we soon discovered that the condoms don't really have the density required to catapult them over prison walls. You know, they're
Oh
really
no.
but it was a good photo opportunity. But most of what we did really involved blocking traffic, because we realized very quickly that the mainstream media would turn a blind eye to most of what we were doing. But if you held up the traffic, you would make the traffic news, if nothing else.
So now you're here. What's next for you?
Well, I've got a seventh novel on the go, which I'd started before COVID. Just before COVID, actually, about a year before, I published a novel called The Closer I Get, which was a crime novel. I decided to write this novel, and through being part of the crime writing community, I met lots of other crime writers there. It's a very, very supportive, mutually supportive community, actually, the crime writing community. And it was suggested to me that there were these prison visits and I should go and do a prison visit. And I sort of made a decision when I turned 50 that I would say yes to things that made me a bit scared or that I was a bit nervous of, and I would try and be braver. And the thought of going into prison and talking to, you know, some pretty hard men was quite scary for me at the first time I did it. And I went along and gave this talk, and it just changed my whole perspective. It was absolutely amazing. They were so incredible as an audience, and they asked such interesting questions and were so engaged. So I then went on and I did a few other and more prison visits, and I did writing workshops with the prison as well. Anyway, through that, I had the idea to write about a character who's been in prison, and then the novel starts on the day of his release from prison. You don't know what he's in for initially at the beginning of the story, and somebody from his past, by pure coincidence, he happens across somebody from his past and sets in motion this horrible chain of events. And so that was the book I was working on, and I put it on the back burner to write the memoir. So I've gone back to that. I'm also working on another idea for another non-fiction book, which is more about it's not about myself. It's about people who've inspired me, writers, thinkers, artists. But there's a sort of common theme, which is they're all connected, because they were all people that I discovered through David Bowie, because David Bowie was such a polymath and was always referencing other artists that he'd often nicked ideas from. But through him, I got a huge education, and he was largely self-taught, self-educated, and incredibly well-read, and had a very, very scattered brain. I watched the documentary Moon Age Daydream, which I thought was fantastic, because it really felt like being inside his head, the way that he worked. You know, he had a very low attention span. He would do something and he would get bored and move on very, very quickly. He was possibly ADHD, actually, looking back in retrospect. And it just seemed to me that was quite a good idea for a book where the chapters are linked, but they're all about very, very different people, but it jumps around the place. I haven't worked out quite how to do it yet, so that's still in the early stages. But the novel is called The Monster in Me, and I've got most of that in my head sorted out now. So I'm working on that first, I think.
So we may see you next year.
Yes.
When it's finished and published.
Yes.
In the meantime, it's been great talking to you. Great success with the book, which is available. We're going to put the details online after this, but thank you so much.
The pleasure.
I wish you could swim like dolphins can swim. Though nothing will keep us together. We can beat them forever.